Welcome back to the second part of our small experiment where we're building a server-side rendered mini app. And so let's now implement the idea of hydration to really make it work. So we already have the server of our web application. Now we also need the client. So basically the JavaScript file that will then be attached to the HTML and which should then run on the client. So let's just call that client.js. Let's just do a quick console.log here for now. And then what we think we can do is to just add that here. So we just do a script with a source and then just our client.js. So that looks like it might work, right? However, if we go to our console here, let's close this. So if we come here and reload, we see that nothing happens. And also, let's see if we get an error here. So this is not big enough. And so we see that we also don't get an error. Let's just check out here the source. And so here we also don't see the script tag. So let's just close this here and restart again. Maybe that is necessary to read in this HTML again. And yeah, now it is there. And so now if we reload here, then we see that actually here the client.js file is requested. However, as we see here, this URL cannot be found. So where is that coming from? Well, actually, that's exactly what we have here. So this is the response to client.js. So that's weird, right? Well, not really, because we don't have like any route here on our server. So right now, basically what's being requested there is just this, client.js. And so indeed we get the URL cannot be found. So to fix this, we need to add a route for this. So let's do that here instead of the test. And then we do send along exactly that JavaScript file. So the way we can do that is to read that in again like this one. So like we read in the HTML. So let's call this client.js. And then here also client.js. And of course, behind the scenes, this is not really what Next.js does. So they have some bundlers and a lot of stuff behind the scenes. But again, here we just want to apply the concepts. The code is not really what matters. We just want the concepts themselves. And so for that, we are just hard coding here this client file to also be sent to the client. So when the client requests it, then there will be basically a route here, and then we can receive that on our front end. So here we send along the client.js, and we also need to add the correct header here, because now this is not text HTML, but application/JavaScript. So now let's see again, and indeed there's our console.log. And let's go back to our main page. And indeed, there is the hey that is being logged from here. So now the script is correctly being requested to the browser and then sent from the browser to the client. And so then the code executes, and then we have our hey logged to the console. Great. So that part is working, but what we really want to do is to, again, now hydrate basically this React code on the client. So what we're going to do is to just copy and paste this React code also to client.js. And again, in practice, you would never ever do that. So we would have this file or this code in different modules, and then our module bundler would kind of take care of injecting that here into server, and to also have it in the bundle that gets sent to the client. But again, we're not interested in that. We want to keep it as simple as possible. So we'll just duplicate the code here. And so now we have all our components here in the client, but we do have the same problem that we had earlier on the server, which is that, of course, these components here are not valid JavaScript. And so we also need to add Babel here to our front end. Luckily for us, that is a lot easier. So let's just search for Babel CDN. So we're just going to be able to include like a CDN link here. So let's just copy this one and paste that right here into our HTML. And then we're also going to need React. So again, React is only on the server right now, but we don't have any React anywhere on the client, right? All the code that we have on the client is the HTML string that is being sent from the server, and also all the code that is here in the client.js file that is also sent along. So this is basically the bundle that we had in the diagram in the previous video. So remember how there the HTML was sent and then the JavaScript bundle. And so that bundle is basically this, which again would be generated by a bundler on the server instead of duplicating this code here. But yeah, as I mentioned, we are only interested in the concepts. So we also need to include React from a CDN. Let's see this one. And here we get to the old documentation page, but this code here is actually still correct. So let's copy this. And if for some reason you cannot find this link here anymore, you can just write it out here, because actually this is pretty similar to what we already have here. Okay, so now with this we have loaded Babel and we have loaded also JavaScript here to our front-end application. So instead of setting up a Vite or a create React app application here, we are just doing it basically manually. So here we now, since this client.js contains now the JSX code, this is where we use the Babel package. So here we can just say type text/Babel. All right, and so if we now open this, we should get no errors whatsoever. But also we need to restart. So remember that previously also any changes that we did here were not reflected. Yeah, so now we get some stuff here. And so we can probably also see that now we have more requests here. Yeah, so now we're downloading all of these packages. And so that means that now we can use React here in our client-side application, which again is just this file. So now is where the magic happens again. So in a typical Vite or create React app, we would do create root, and then here we would just select some HTML element and pass our app in there. So again, we would use create root to create a brand new React tree on the client. But now we already have basically the React tree, because we already have the pre-rendered React tree in the form of HTML that's coming from the server. And so now we don't want to create a new root, but we want to hydrate it. So let's use react.dom. And here, of course, we don't import anything because we're simply using this React DOM as it is imported or downloaded as a script right here. So that will then basically create a global object. So as we see, it's already here in the browser. And so from there, again, we will then use the hydrate root function. So let's close this guy. React DOM dot hydrate root. And then here we again need to select the element. So let's do get element by ID. Then we select the one with the root ID. And then here is where we pass in the React tree, which just like on the server is the home component. So then the tree will be the home component with a bunch of menu items where each one contains a counter. And so this tree right here needs to be exactly the same one as the one that is coming from the server. Otherwise, we're going to get some DOM hydration errors. All right, and this part right here is actually all we need to perform the hydration. So if we reload this now, then we didn't get any errors. Well, we still get the hey here. So let's stop this here and reload, because this watch flag right here really only watches this file right there, not all the other ones. All right, and what happens here? Of course, we forgot the pizzas object. So without this, we cannot render anything at all. So let's also grab this one, paste that here, then again finish. So maybe we could have used NodeMon here instead, but well, this also works. Okay, and now let's see. Beautiful, it works. Great. So now we actually did the 2 steps of completely rendering the application. The first step happened on the server, where the HTML was generated as a string and then sent to the browser. And then in the second part, we added back the event handlers and all the interactivity. So the event handlers are here on the onClick, and the interactivity is of course provided by the useState hook. So let's just now see this even better, because if we do some slow 3G throttling here, then we will see that initially the buttons will still not work, because let's see. So I'm going to reload this now. And so now we have the buttons here, but they don't work. That's because React is still being downloaded in the background. So all the React scripts and also our own client.js. And so while we only have this HTML, then of course the buttons don't work. But again, we can already see the content, which in many cases is already more than enough. So we already had very early on the first content paint. It wasn't interactive yet, but actually now everything has loaded. And so indeed, now we can click here. Great. And so now the concepts that we looked at in the diagrams hopefully also make a lot more sense in the code. So we basically built our very own solution, which both renders on the server and then even hydrates that result on the client. So I think this was a really, really nice experiment, and I really did enjoy building this. So maybe take a look again of how everything fit together here, the 2 important parts of the server and of the client, and especially the 2 most important parts here. So that's the render to string, where first the components are transformed to HTML, and then in the hydrate, which basically kind of does the opposite. It takes the HTML and it takes our React code and adds them back together. All right, now luckily for you, you will never have to write this kind of code again, because we do have frameworks that take away all of this work from us and also do a much, much better job. For example, instead of just rendering this to a string, frameworks like Next.js are able to even stream the content piece by piece to the client, which makes a lot of sense if there is a lot of content. And so, after doing and finishing this nice experiment, it's time to move on to a real-world solution. And so that's the Next.js framework that we're going to look at in the next lecture. So now that we know exactly what server-side rendering is and even implemented a very simple demo of it, let's start learning about a React framework that will allow us to use the power of server-side rendering in our own apps. So without having to do it manually. And of course, that framework is called Next.js. And as always, let's begin by understanding what Next.js actually is in this lecture. So, according to Vercel, the company that's behind Next.js, Next.js is the React framework for the web. Now that's a pretty bold statement, and so let's unpack it just a little bit. First of all, we can say that Next.js is a meta framework built on top of React. So meta because if we consider React itself a framework, then Next.js is a framework on top of another framework. And this is actually becoming quite common in web development these days, with Next being the meta framework for Vue, SvelteKit the meta framework for Svelte, and so on. Now, the fact that Next.js is built on top of React means that, of course, we get to use all the things from React that we already know and love. So things like components, props, React hooks, and so on are still important in the world of Next.js. Now, what Next.js adds on top of all that is a set of conventions and best practices about common things that we usually always need to implement in any real-world application. So things like routing, data fetching, and a bunch of other stuff that we'll see in the next slide. Because of this, we say that the framework is opinionated, because these conventions are based on what the engineers at Vercel, who built the framework, came up with. So we can, for example, not implement routing in any way we want. We have to learn and follow the way things work in Next.js. But that's actually a great thing, because this way we can avoid writing so much boilerplate code and just start building our app features right away. Plus, having a fixed set of rules makes building apps as a team a lot easier, because if everyone knows Next.js and follows the same standards, then applications will get built faster, with fewer bugs, and with a much better developer experience. So, in the end, as a result of all this, Next.js allows us to build complex, full-stack web applications and websites with React, complete with data fetching and data mutations on the server, as we'll see in the next slide. But before that, I want to finish by mentioning that Next.js implements all the cutting-edge React features like React Server Components, Server Actions, Suspense, and many more that are nearly impossible for us to use without them being integrated into a framework. All these pieces are actually part of the React team's full-stack architecture vision, which, again, needs to be implemented by some framework like Next.js, but it can also be some other framework like Remix. Now, in fact, Next.js was the first framework to implement React Server Components, and really making this awesome new feature available to all React developers. Okay, but now that we know what Next.js is, let's dive a bit deeper and take a look at the main things that Next.js actually brings to the table, which is what I call the 4 Next.js key ingredients. So those are, first of course, server-side rendering, as we've talked about before. And Next.js supports both dynamic and static rendering, which we can basically select for each route. Now, to navigate through the application, Next.js comes with a router out of the box, or actually even 2 routers, as we'll see in the next slide. And what's special about this router is that routes are defined entirely based on file system-based conventions. For example, we can create a basic route in our Next.js app simply by creating a new folder with the route name, and that's it. No need to write any code. And this was really a game changer when Next.js was first introduced. There are also special file conventions for pages, layouts, errors, loading screens, and so on. And now, probably the most important part is that Next.js gives us the ability to fetch and mutate data right from the server by using those React server components and server actions that we talked about a bit earlier. And this is a fundamental shift from building React apps the way that we have done up until now, which was entirely on the client, right? So there was no access to any server whatsoever in all the apps that we built before. But again, by implementing React server components and server actions, data fetching and mutations are now possible to execute within a React app running on a server. This means there will be a few new React things to learn, but I think it's totally gonna be worth it. But anyway, finally, Next.js provides us with a host of optimization techniques for our apps, and especially for websites where they are particularly important. So this is stuff like automatic route preloading, image and font optimization, both of which bring huge performance gains, and also tools for improving search engine optimization. Now, remember how I mentioned earlier that there are actually two routers in Next.js. Those are the app router and the pages router. And these two routers are basically two completely different ways of building Next.js applications. They're almost like two completely separate frameworks. So, the modern way of writing Next.js apps is by using the app router, which became stable in 2023 in version 13.4 and is now the recommended way of starting new projects. That's because this is the router that implements the React team's full-stack architecture vision that we have talked about a few times so far. So again, that's the cutting-edge React features like server components and actions, suspense, streaming, and so on. So all these are only available in the modern app router, but not in the pages router. So that pages router is the legacy router that we've been using since version 1 of Next.js, so all the way back in 2016. Now, even though it's the legacy router and is no longer recommended for new projects, it will still be actively maintained in the future and might even get some updates. But despite that, in this part 5 of the course, we're going to learn the app router from the very beginning. And then at the end of part 5, there's also a section where you're quickly going to learn just the very fundamentals of the pages router if you want, in case you ever need to work on an older Next.js project. But anyway, while this pages router is a bit more simple and easier to learn, it comes with its drawbacks, which is the whole reason why the app router was implemented. For example, things that should be easy, like building application-wide layouts, are pretty confusing in the pages router for some reason. Also, to fetch data, we need to use some Next.js specific APIs such as getStaticProps and getServerSide props, which are not native React functions and only work at the page level, not at an individual component level. In the app router, on the other hand, we can just use the fetch function that we already know in order to fetch data in any server component that we want, which is pretty awesome, as you'll see soon. It's also extremely easy to implement layouts, error boundaries, loading states, and so on. And on top of that, the app router allows for some pretty advanced routing patterns, like parallel routing and intercepting routes. Plus, building apps in this new paradigm gives us, in my opinion, a significantly better developer experience and even user experience, especially because we have server components now, which make building Next.js apps really fun. And I know that's a controversial thing to say, but this is just my opinion. However, not everything is great. So the most annoying thing about the app router is, without a doubt, the super aggressive caching, which is not only really confusing and hard to understand, but even worse, many times does things that we actually don't want. Now, this will probably maybe change in the future, but for now, working with and around Next.js's caching mechanisms is a huge pain point. Also, I think that the learning curve for the new app router is significantly steeper than in the Pages router. But, well, at least you're mostly actually going to be learning new React features. And you're also learning a more capable framework than what we have with the Pages router. Okay, so there you have it. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of everything that's different between these two ways of writing Next.js apps, but I think it's mostly what you need to know. Everything else will be covered as we go through the rest of the course. And speaking of the rest of the course, let's now finally set up our very first Next.js project. Okay, so now that we know what Next.js is, let's create our very first Next.js project. And creating a new Next.js project is as easy as setting up a new React project using Vite or Create React App. So just fire up your terminal in whatever folder that you want to create your new project. So for me, I'm on the desktop right now. And then let's just run npx create next app at latest, or at least that's how you would do it if you were to set it up in the future yourself. But in this case, I want you to use actually version 14 of Next.js, so that we are both using the exact same version of the framework. So Next.js comes out with a new version like every year, and so to make sure that everything works exactly in the same way as it works in the video, for now, in this project, please use Next.js version 14. I will show you in the next video, or actually probably a text lecture is enough, how you can update a Next.js version in a very easy way. So again, npx create next app at version 14, and then the name of the project. So we're actually going to create, as I think I mentioned earlier, but maybe not. So we are going to create throughout this entire part 5 of the course, the customer-facing website of the Wild Oasis project that we built earlier. So basically, based on the same data, we're now going to build a website where customers can check out all the cabins, and they can even create reservations and check out their account, where they can change some profile data and also delete and update their own reservations. So this is going to be a really cool project, but in this section, we're actually not really gonna start building that project, but we're only gonna explore Next.js a little bit. So really the project itself will start in the next section, but in this one, we will already start building some small parts. So we're already start this project right now in this section. So let's call this the Wild Oasis website. Then hit enter. And then here, of course, we need to then install or allow Create Next App to install this package. Now here, this will ask us a couple of questions, and with our keyboard, we can just select yes or no. So first, do you want to use TypeScript? Well, ideally, you would probably use TypeScript, but we're not going to use this in this course because I simply want everyone to understand this project, even if they don't know anything about TypeScript yet. So no TypeScript here. ESLint, yes, please. And next up, they are asking us if we want to use Tailwind. So Tailwind is tightly integrated into Next.js and will actually use it to style our website. And so here the answer is again yes, then here also no, and then here the app router. So remember from the last lecture that we have the pages router and the app router. And the app router, as it says here, is now the recommended way. And so of course, that's what we're going to do. So here also no. So basically we're always using the defaults except for the TypeScript part. But if you know TypeScript, of course, you can also select yes in there. So now this is going to install all of the dependencies. And so let's just wait for that. All right, then let's move in there. The Wild Oasis website. And then we can type code dot. I think that's the first time I actually did this in the course. So that's just the way we can do it using the code command. Or as always, you can just drag and drop it there. And actually, let me close this because I need to give it the number as always so that it stays nicely ordered. So this one is 21. And there we go. All right. So we see we have a lot of stuff right here, and we're not going to go through all of this here. So we already have the Tailwind config. This one is also about Tailwind. Maybe if you're seeing this or if you're using this in the future, then this will look different because Tailwind will probably change. So we have a package.json file because a Next.js app is essentially a Node.js app as well, because of course Next.js needs to implement a server, and so for that they use Node.js just like we did in our manual example. So you can check out all the dependencies here, and another important one is going to be the Next.js config file, which for now is empty, but we're going to add some stuff here in the future. Here we have some ESLint rules, so let's just leave this empty as well. Then we have the public folder, which just like in Vite and in Create React App is where we can place some static assets that we want to serve to the users. Now, what's most important here is actually this app folder. So having this app folder here is what enables the app router to be used. Now, if we wanted to use the pages router that I also talked about in the previous lecture, so we would have selected that, of course, in the previous step when we set up this project. But if we were to do it manually, we would just create a folder, not here, but out here, and that would then be called pages. And we could then delete the app folder and use the pages router instead. But that's not what we want to do. We really want to use the app folder. So here we have a few files already. We have a page.js, a layout.js, and some CSS file and icon. So I actually want to delete these three. So deleting all of these junk files here that are always there in the beginning and just leaving the page.js file. Now, for now, it doesn't matter what this means. We will talk about this very soon. For now, what we're going to do is to just delete all of this code right here. So this is like the placeholder code that they have. And so let's just export an H1 saying hello next. Also don't need this. And here let's even call it page. So this is just a component here, a regular React component that is being exported as a default function here from page.js. All right, And now let's actually start up our application. So we can go into our package.json to see what command we should use. And so we're probably, what's this? Well, this automatically started apparently the process. Okay, but anyway, this is the one that we're interested in here. So we want to run npm run dev. And as you could see here, in my case at least, that this also set up a brand new Git repository automatically. You can also see it down here in VS Code. And so that's just another useful thing that Next.js does for us. All right, now this doesn't automatically open up a new tab in the browser, but we can just command click here. And so then that's going to open. And here we have our hello next. Beautiful. And let's see the page source here, which will contain a lot of stuff. But what matters is that actually we have our h1 right here, which means that it has been generated on the server. So if this was just a regular React app, we of course could see that h1 right here in the elements. So it would be here, somewhere here, because this always shows the current DOM. But this here is really the source that was downloaded. So it came directly from the server. And so that contains hello next. So basically what we have here in the page. And so this means that this was indeed server-side rendered and then sent to the browser. Nice. So with this, we have now a working Next.js app that is already server rendering some HTML here. And now in the next video, let's start adding some routes and some more pages here so that we really get going with Next.js. Let's now quickly learn how we can very easily add new routes and pages to any Next.js application. So in our app, let's say that we want to be able to go to /cabins, /about, and /account. So basically 3 routes that we want to set up here. Now in earlier projects, we used React Router in order to set up routes in our single page application. So that required a lot of boilerplate and setup code, but in Next.js, we don't need any of that. So remember how we learned that in the app router, all we need is to create some folders and some files in order to create pages and routes. And so let's do that right here in the app folder. Also notice how we earlier deleted layout.js, but now it is actually back. So that's what we have here in the console. So it says did not have a root layout, so we created one for you. But we will learn later how layouts work. So let's just close that and take a look at it later. So now inside app, we just create a folder called cabins. All right. Now this alone is not enough yet. So if we go to /cabins, that's not really going to do anything. The reason for that is that inside this folder, we now need to create a JavaScript file. And that needs to be called by convention page.js. So that error that we had earlier has gone away, but we have a different error, which simply says that we're not exporting any component here. So basically, each page in Next.js is simply a React component that we export from a page.js file, which needs to be inside of some folder. So let's do that. Export default function, and here we can actually call it whatever we want. So we could call this cabins page, but by default, I think it's kind of a convention that we always call them just page. And now this is, again, just a component, and actually a React server component, but more about that a bit later. But what this means is that whatever JavaScript that we write here will be server-side rendered. So let's write an h1 here, just say this is the cabins page. All right. And so if we reload now, then beautiful. We are on our cabins page. And that's all we had to do to set up a new page. Now, what if we wanted cabins and then /test? Can you maybe guess how that would work? Because now that is gone again. Well, all we have to do is inside this folder, create another one. Test again, and then, you guessed it, in there, another page.js, and then export default function page. Let's return an h3 maybe. And there we go. So this is how we create longer URLs with multiple segments. So each folder is responsible for each of the segments in this URL. So we are here in the beginning at the root, so that's app. Then we want /cabins. For that we create the cabins folder, and then we want /test, and for that we have the test folder. Okay, but this was just a demo, so let's delete this because we're not really interested in that. All right, and so let's actually create another one. Now we can do some more complex stuff with routes, but we're going to go into that a bit later, like dynamic routes where we can then read a parameter from here, like an ID or something. But for now, we just want to set up some very simple routes. So we have the cabins route already. Next up, let's do that again. So now we want the about route, and then we want an account route. Okay, page.js, and another page.js in here. So as you see, we are starting to have many page.js's here, which can become quite confusing. But I will show you a nice small trick in a minute that can help us with this. So now I'm just going to copy and paste these here into all of them. So here we are in the accounts page. Well, let's give it some other name here, some other title. So your account. And here this is about the wild oasis. And here in our homepage, so the page.js that is in the root folder, here let's say the wild oasis. Welcome to paradise. So let's check. Then we have account, and we should have the about page. Beautiful. Now we don't have a way yet to link between these pages here so that we seamlessly move from one to the other, but let's leave that to another lecture. So now let me show you that trick that I was talking about, where here we have all these page.js, which can become a little bit tricky to navigate. Now here we have actually the folder name, which I think is a default new setting from VS Code, but we can make this even better with another brand new setting that was just released into VS Code. And this is completely optional, so you don't need to do what I'm going to do now. I just want to show you. So we have this new feature called custom labels. So here you need to enable this, and then here we can add a new item. So let's do like this, and then app, and then page.js. So basically we want to target all the page.js files that are inside any folder inside the app folder. This part maybe is not necessary. So then here we can write whatever we want. So I like to call it page, and then here we have access to these different basically variables. So here then we need to use the dir name, because that's basically the name of the page, right? So here in the cabins page, the name of the actual page is cabins. So the name of the directory. So that's this one right here. And so now indeed, here it says page cabins, page account, page about. So you could also just do like this. So you could really customize it in any way that you wanted. And so then all the files called page.js would adopt this format right here. And with this, we have a lot easier time to actually identify what we are working on. All right, so I hope this will clear up any confusion that you might have about all these tabs that I have open. Okay, so let me actually close all of them. And so for this lecture, we are done. So we have learned how we can set up some very simple routes, how we can even have routes with multiple segments, so like the about or the cabins/test that we had before. And we know how we can use the convention of page.js. And there are other conventions like these. Like we have a layout.js, a loading.js, we have error.js, and some more. So these are all conventions that the Next.js team came up with and that we can use to build these different parts of a Next.js application. But more about those later in the course. For now, what we're going to do is to learn how we can effectively navigate between these different routes. So we have our routes and our pages now, and so now it's time to learn how we can actually navigate between these pages. So what we want to do is to add a link here to the home page that will link to our cabins page. So let's first wrap the whole thing here into a div, like so. And so as a first try, we can attempt to add a regular anchor element. So just an href, and then let's specify the route like so. And then here, let's say explore luxury cabins. All right. So let's go back to our homepage here, and then let's see what happens. Well, actually this page could not be found, but the reason for that is that here it needs to be cabins. So that's the name of the folder here. So exactly the route that we created in the previous lecture. So let's reload that, let's click that, and that actually works. So we did move to the cabins page, but notice, especially when you look up here, that this will then create a full page reload. So let's maybe do that here again a bit slower. So if we click here, you see that the whole page is fetched again. So the whole application is downloaded again. And so basically we have a full hard reload as we move between pages in this way. And so that's not what we want at all. Instead, we want our application to feel a bit like a single page application like we had before. And so that's why Next.js provides to us the link component. So let's stop this here. So no throttling. Let's go back. And so then let's use actually that link component that I was just talking about. So here, instead of the anchor, we're going to use this link. And so this should automatically import, but we can also do that manually. So just import link from, and then next/link. So that's the Next.js package from which we can import this link component right here. And remember how actually in React Router, we also had a link component like this. The difference was that there we needed to specify the to prop instead of href. But this is a lot nicer because this is also exactly the same prop as in the native HTML anchor element. So then here we still specify the route just like this, like we had before. And if we now, let's just reload here, we click here now, Then notice how immediately the app moved to this cabins page without the hard full reload. So this is a lot nicer, and it really feels now, even though we're server rendering, like a single page application. And so that's the power of the link component. So behind the scenes, what this does is to apply a few optimization techniques. So first of all, it will actually prefetch all the routes that are linked on a certain page, even though that only works in production. So we cannot see that happening here in development. What also happens is that each page is downloaded separately as a separate chunk, which will also improve performance again. And finally, each page that we visit in the browser will actually be cached right in the browser as well. So it will be stored there temporarily. And then as we move around, all these pages will not have to be refetched again. Now we're going to talk about all of this more in detail later, but it's good to have an idea early on that Next.js provides all of these nice features out of the box. Now, just like React Router, Next.js also provides us with some React hooks for programmatic navigation. However, these are not going to work in these page components because, as I mentioned earlier, they are server components, and React hooks don't work there, as we're going to learn very soon. So just wanted to mention that because we will use some of those hooks also in the future. Now, what I want to do next is to build kind of a navigation already. So like a navigation which has a link to all the pages that we have. So that should be a reusable component. And so for that, let's actually create a components folder. So just like we had also in other applications, components like this. And in there, let's then create navigation.js. Now, since we added another folder here in our app folder, this will actually create a new route in the Next.js app called /components, like this. However, this will actually not work because we don't have a page.js in there. So we will still get this page could not be found. But if we did have a page.js in here for some reason, then this would become a new page in the application. Now that's actually not what we want. And so we will fix that a bit later when we will talk about how to organize our project with some better project architecture. But for now, let's just leave this components folder here like this and create ourselves this navigation. So export default function, let's call it navigation. And so here, let's return an unordered list. So a very typical navigation structure. And then here, again, we want that link. So for some reason, we don't get the auto imports here, but let's take care of that in a minute. So href like this. So the first one will be actually, again, the cabins page. All right. And so now we need to actually import that. So import link from next/link. And then let's just duplicate this here a few more times. So we're going to have then also the about page. So about, and then account, let's say your account. And now we can go back to page.js and just import that right here. Navigation. And there we go. So here we have an auto import. And beautiful. So as we click here, again, we get that single page application feel. And it works for all the other pages as well. Now, usually we want a navigation in all of our pages, right? So what we could do is to come here, also convert this to a div first. And then we could import the navigation here as well, like so. So if we go there now, Then here, of course, we have the same navigation. Well, actually, we should add the homepage there as well, I guess. So that's the root URL, and then home. And so then, let's reload that. And actually here, in this short second, you saw the result of caching. So here we still had that navigation with only 3 points without the home. And so that's because we were still serving the cached page that Next.js had cached in our browsers. So that's pretty interesting, but again, we will talk more about that later. So now we can just move seamlessly between these pages, but of course, not between these ones, because they do not have that navigation. So what we could do, of course, is to now also go to all these other pages and add the navigation there as well, but that's not usually what we want. We want this to be some kind of reusable layout. And so layouts is going to be our next topic right in the next lecture.